In 2013, Zappos CEO Tony Hca stood in front of the company and announced something almost no large business had ever tried on purpose. Zappos was going to eliminate traditional management. No job titles, no managers in the conventional sense, no org chart with boxes and arrows pointing up to a boss. Instead, the company would run on something called holacracy, a system where authority and decision-making got distributed across self-organizing teams called circles. The pitch, on paper, was intoxicating. No bureaucracy slowing people down. No hierarchy protecting mediocre decisions just because they came from someone with a bigger title. Pure autonomy, pure ownership, everyone empowered to act instead of waiting for permission. 2 years later, roughly 18% of the company took a buyout to leave, all at once, and turnover stayed elevated for years after that. The story of what happened in between is one of the most instructive management experiments of the last 2 decades, not because it proves flat organizations are a bad idea, but because of exactly what broke and why. To understand why Hsieh reached for something this radical, you have to understand what Zappos already was before holacracy showed up. This wasn't a struggling company looking for a Hail Mary. Zappos had built one of the most admired service cultures in American retail, an online shoe and clothing company that famously let call center employees stay on the phone with a customer for hours, if that's what it took, that flew customers flowers, that hired and fired explicitly around a defined set of core values rather than just skills. Hsieh wrote a best-selling book about it, Delivering Happiness, and Zappos culture tours became something other executives paid money to attend. This was a company that had already proven it could build extraordinary things through unconventional thinking. Hsieh's instinct with holacracy came from the same place as everything else he'd tried, a genuine belief that the standard corporate playbook, hierarchy, job titles, top-down authority, was actively limiting how good the company could become. He wasn't chasing a fad. He was extending a philosophy that had already worked for him once. Holacracy itself wasn't invented at Zappos. It came from a framework developed by Brian Robertson, a software entrepreneur who formalized it around 2007 through a company called Holacracy One, publishing what amounted to a constitution for how organizations could govern themselves without traditional management. The mechanics are genuinely intricate. Instead of a job title, an employee holds one or more roles, each with clearly defined responsibilities and authorities, and a single person can hold multiple roles across multiple circles at once. Circles are semi-autonomous teams organized around a specific purpose, and circles nest inside broader circles, theoretically letting authority flow outward from the center rather than downward from an executive suite. 2 kinds of meetings run the system: tactical meetings, which handle day-to-day operational issues, and governance meetings, where the team can actually rewrite its own roles and rules when something isn't working, a process built around surfacing what practitioners call tensions, the gap between how something currently works and how it could work better. In theory, it's an elegant, almost biological model of organizational self-correction. In practice, at Zappos, it required employees to internalize a rulebook, the holacracy constitution, that ran past 10,000 words. Zappos didn't ease into this. Hsieh went all in, publicly, and the timing lined up with a broader intellectual movement around what author Frederic Laloux called teal organizations in his book Reinventing Organizations, a framework describing companies evolving past hierarchy into self-managing, purpose-driven systems. Zappos became the largest, most visible, real-world test case of these ideas, and the business press covered it accordingly, equal parts fascinated and skeptical. For a while, this made Zappos a magnet for a certain kind of talent, people who'd read about self-management and wanted to work somewhere actually trying it at scale. It also made Zappos a magnet for scrutiny, because everyone in management circles wanted to know whether this radical bet would actually work when applied to a company with thousands of employees running real operations, not a 12-person startup where everyone already knows each other's job. The friction showed up fast, and it showed up in the mundane places you'd expect. Employees described spending hours in circle meetings, not solving customer problems or improving processes, but passing holacracy's own governance rules, debating whether a particular action fell inside or outside someone's defined role authority, essentially doing legal interpretation of an internal constitution instead of doing their actual jobs. For people who'd joined Zappos to answer phones and solve customer problems creatively, this represented a strange inversion, where the system, built to remove bureaucracy, had generated a new, more abstract bureaucracy of its own. Meetings that used to take 20 minutes stretched into hour-long procedural exercises. And crucially, none of this abstraction came with an obvious payoff that employees could feel in their daily work. The autonomy was real. The clarity that was supposed to come with it often wasn't. Consider the concrete situation of a mid-level employee who's been at Zappos for 2 years and wants a raise. In a traditional structure, however imperfect, there's a person whose job is explicitly to advocate for that raise, someone who tracks your performance over time, who has a formal channel to push compensation decisions upward, who owns the outcome, even if the process is slow or political. Under holacracy, that person functionally doesn't exist. Compensation and advancement got tied to more diffuse, self-assessed processes, and multiple employees described genuine uncertainty about how to get ahead at all. Not because the company had become stingier, but because nobody held clear personal accountability for making sure people's growth happened. Ambition needs a target to aim at. Remove the person whose job is to catch that ambition and route it somewhere. And it doesn't disappear. It just has nowhere to go. Now picture a different situation. Something goes wrong on a project, a shipment issue, a customer service failure that spirals, a process that quietly breaks and nobody notices until it's expensive. In a traditional hierarchy, however flawed, there's an obvious next step. You escalate to your manager. Under holacracy, the theoretically correct move is to raise attention in the relevant circle's next governance meeting and work it through the defined process. In practice, several employees described a much messier reality, a real-time problem needing real-time judgment, but the system built to root authority felt too slow, too abstract, or too unclear about who actually had standing to make the call right now. Accountability without a name attached to it isn't really accountability. It's diffusion, and diffusion tends to make urgent problems linger exactly when speed matters most. There's a fourth kind of situation worth walking through too, because it's the one that probably did the most quiet, cumulative damage. Ordinary cross-functional friction. Two circles disagree about who owns a piece of work, a warehouse operations circle and a customer service circle, both touching the same shipping delay problem, say. In a traditional structure, two managers have an uncomfortable but bounded conversation, or it goes up to whoever manages both of them, and a decision gets made, even if it's not perfect. Under holacracy, resolving that kind of overlap is supposed to happen through the governance process, surfacing the tension, proposing a role change, running it through a structured meeting. Employees described this process working reasonably well for genuinely structural, recurring issues, but poorly for one-off situational conflicts that needed a fast, pragmatic call, rather than a permanent rule change. The system was built to evolve roles over time, not to referee an argument happening right now between two people who both think they're right. That mismatch between what holacracy was designed to solve and the actual texture of daily friction inside a large operation kept resurfacing in slightly different forms. And it's a big part of why employees describe the system as exhausting in a way that had nothing to do with workload. Not everyone experienced holacracy the same way, and that split is itself revealing. Some employees, generally the ones with an entrepreneurial streak, people who already thrived on ambiguity and enjoyed shaping their own scope of work, genuinely flourished. They built new roles for themselves, took on responsibilities nobody had explicitly assigned them, and described real satisfaction in the autonomy holacracy handed them. But a large number of others, arguably the majority based on how the exits played out, wanted something holacracy structurally couldn't offer: a person accountable for their development, someone who noticed when they were struggling and stepped in, a clear answer to, who do I talk to about my career? Autonomy and mentorship aren't automatically in conflict, but a system that eliminates the second while maximizing the first will predictably lose the people who need the second more than they crave the first. Zappos wasn't the only company to run this experiment, which makes the comparison useful. Valve, the video game company behind Half-Life and Steam, has run a famously flat structure for years. No formal managers, desks on wheels, so employees can physically roll themselves toward whatever project interests them. It's worked reasonably well there, but Valve is a small, extremely selective, single-industry company where nearly every employee shares deep technical context and a similar risk appetite. GitHub tried something structurally similar in its early years, minimal management layers, and eventually walked it back as the company scaled past a few hundred people, citing exactly the kind of accountability gaps Zappos ran into: new hires unsure who owned their onboarding, unclear ownership when a decision needed to be made fast. The pattern across all three companies is consistent. Flatness tends to hold up in small, homogeneous, high-context teams, and it tends to strain hard once a company reaches the size and diversity of workforce where informal accountability can no longer cover for the absence of formal accountability. Zappos, with thousands of employees across warehouse operations, customer service, merchandising, and corporate functions, was always going to be a harder test than a 100-person game studio. In 2015, Shea made the split explicit. He offered every employee who felt uncomfortable with the new structure a severance package to leave immediately, framing it as a values alignment filter, essentially asking the org to self-select down to people who genuinely wanted to work this way. About 18% of the company took it on the spot, an enormous single-event exodus for any company, let alone one that had spent years building a reputation for extraordinary employee loyalty. Turnover didn't snap back to normal afterward either. It stayed elevated for years, a slow, ongoing signal that the mismatch between the system and what a meaningful chunk of the workforce actually wanted hadn't fully resolved with one buyout wave. What happened next is the part that gets left out of most retellings. Zappos never publicly reversed course, and holacracy's language stayed part of the company's official identity for a long time afterward. But internal reporting years later described something quieter. A company that had, in practice, reintroduced more traditional structure and clearer lines of accountability, even while keeping holacracy's vocabulary intact on paper. This is an important nuance, because it's not really a story about an idea being proven entirely wrong and then discarded. It's a story about an organization discovering, expensively, which specific human needs a purely circle-based system couldn't meet, and then quietly rebuilding a way to meet them without officially admitting the experiment had a ceiling. The common mistake here isn't wanting less bureaucracy. Almost everyone wants less bureaucracy. The mistake is assuming that removing hierarchy removes the underlying functions hierarchy exists to serve. A manager, at their best, isn't just an approval bottleneck. They're the person who owns someone's growth trajectory, who's accountable when something breaks under their team, who provides a clear, named point of contact when a problem needs escalating fast. Strip out the title in the org chart box, and those needs don't evaporate along with it. They just go looking for a new home, and if the new system hasn't built one, people feel that absence acutely, even if they can't immediately articulate why the freedom they were promised feels more like disorientation. Picture the actual moment this plays out for one employee, because the abstract version of this mistake undersells how it feels from the inside. Someone finishes a strong quarter, handles a difficult account well, picks up slack when a teammate was out. Under a normal structure, even a mediocre manager notices this, mentions it in a one-on-one, maybe pushes for a raise at the next cycle. Under holacracy, that same strong quarter can genuinely go unnoticed, not because anyone at Zappos was unkind or indifferent, but because noticing individual growth and translating it into pay or advancement wasn't clearly assigned to anyone's role. Good work doesn't automatically get seen just because a system is theoretically transparent. It gets seen because someone specific is watching for it, on purpose, as part of their actual job. Remove that job without reassigning its core function, and the system defaults to nobody watching, which is a much worse outcome than one imperfect person watching inconsistently. There's real psychological research behind why this happens, and it lines up closely with what Zappos experienced. Self-determination theory, the framework built by psychologists Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, identifies autonomy as one core human motivational need. But it's explicitly not the only one. Competence and relatedness matter just as much, And relatedness in a work context often runs directly through a clear relationship with someone accountable for your growth. Pure autonomy without a structure supporting the other two needs doesn't reliably produce motivation and satisfaction. It can just as easily produce anxiety, a sense of being unmoored, especially for people who don't already have a strong internal compass for self-direction. Holacracy maximized one need at the expense of the other two, and the 18% who left were disproportionately the people for whom that trade didn't work. There's a separate, more organizational body of research worth naming here too, around what's sometimes called role clarity or role ambiguity in industrial organizational psychology. Decades of studies, going back to work by Robert Kahn and colleagues in the 1960s on organizational stress, consistently link low role clarity to higher anxiety, lower job satisfaction, and higher turnover intent, independent of workload or pay. The mechanism is intuitive once you see it named. Humans tolerate hard work reasonably well, but they tolerate ambiguity about what's expected of them, and who's judging that? Far worse. Holacracy, for all its detailed documentation of roles and authorities on paper, generated a specific kind of ambiguity that no constitution fully resolved. Ambiguity about the informal, relational side of work. Who notices you? Who advocates for you? Who's actually invested in whether you succeed here next year? You can write 10,000 words of governance rules and still leave that question unanswered. So, what's the actual fix here? For a manager or founder looking at Zappos and wondering what to take from it besides, don't try this. It's not that flat structures never work. Small, tightly mission-aligned teams genuinely can run with minimal formal hierarchy, especially when everyone already shares deep context and trust, the way an early-stage startup team often does. The fix is a specific question to ask before flattening anything. For every person in this organization, who owns their growth, who owns their pay, and who do they escalate a real problem to, right now, today? If you can't answer that clearly for a given person, removing their manager's title didn't create autonomy. It created a gap. And gaps in accountability don't stay empty, they get filled with confusion, quietly, one unresolved question at a time. There's a practical version of this fix that doesn't require reverting all the way back to a conventional org chart, and it's worth spelling out because plenty of teams genuinely do want less hierarchy without wanting the specific failure mode Zappos hit. Separate the two things Holacracy bundled together and then failed to fully replace: decision-making authority and human accountability. You can absolutely distribute decision-making authority the way Holacracy intended, letting the person closest to a problem make the call without routing it through 3 layers of approval. That part of the model isn't what broke. What broke was assuming that distributing decision-making authority also distributes the responsibility for a specific human being's growth, pay, and problems, when in practice that responsibility needs to stay concentrated in a named person or it quietly stops happening at all. A team can run flat on operational decisions and still assign every individual employee a clear, accountable point of contact for the things that are about them personally, not about the work. That's a much smaller, more surgical fix than either full hierarchy or full holacracy. And it's the piece most companies attempting flat structures skip. Zappos's holacracy experiment gets taught constantly now, not as a cautionary tale about ambition, but as a precise lesson in what hierarchy is actually for, underneath the parts everyone hates about it. Nobody misses approval chains for the sake of approval chains. What people quietly need, even the most autonomy-hungry among them, is clarity about who's accountable for the things that matter to them personally: their growth, their pay, their problems. Erase the org chart without replacing what it was actually doing, and you haven't built freedom. You've built a system where everyone owns everything, in theory, and where, in practice, nobody clearly owns you. If this kind of case study is your thing, stick around. There's a new one breaking down every week.